What is the worst thing that can happen when you eat bread? That's a rhetorical question. I mean, realistically, the worst thing that could happen is that you choke and die. Which is pretty bad, but, well, that's the risk with eating food, right? Well, if you're a medieval peasant tucking into some bread, there is a possibility that you become violently sick and your extremities begin to blacken and drop off. Or you hallucinate vividly while suffering debilitating seizures. And this could happen to entire communities.
In the year 994 CE, an outbreak of this sickness struck the French regions of Aquitaine, Angoumois, Périgord, and Limousin. According to the chronicler Adémar de Chabannes, sufferers appeared to burn with ignis sacra, holy fire, an invisible flame that blackened the flesh and caused limbs to drop off. 17th century French historian François Hue de Mézeray wrote, "About these times, that sacred fire which they named the burning sickness, and had otherwhile made great destruction, broke out and kindled again, cruelly tormenting France, especially for 2 ages. It seized again on a sudden, and burnt the entrails, or some other part of the body, which fell off piecemeal. Happy were those that escaped with the loss of a leg or an arm. This caused many great donatives to be given to those saints whose help they believed they had received in the midst of their dreadful torments, as likewise the frequent founding of hospitals for such as were infected with this distemper. Some 40,000 people died during this outbreak, and this was only one of dozens which took place in France between the 10th and 15th centuries. But this sickness did not just mortify the flesh. German accounts have sufferers convulsing so violently that they died with their limbs twisted about them. Little was known about the origins of this malady, and during the early modern period, the illness was sometimes mistaken for witchcraft. Communities struck down by a plague of hallucinations, seizures, and violent sickness could turn on themselves, accusing those on the fringes of society of witchery."
What on earth is going on here? How can bread cause such pandemonium? Well, it all comes down to an unassuming little fungus, one that, if eaten, can strike you down with the infamous St. Antony's fire, or as we call it today, ergotism. So, let's meet history's strangest illness.
Ergotism has bedeviled humanity since ancient times. In the Zend-Avesta, a compilation of Zoroastrian holy texts, you can find a reference to the illness causing the deaths of pregnant women in a text written during the 3rd century BCE, though the cause of ergotism was not positively identified until 1596 by German physician Wendelin Thelius. Even today in the developing world, ergotism outbreaks do sometimes occur, though not frequently. It is most associated with the European medieval period, as outbreaks appear to have peaked on the continent between the 10th and 15th centuries. These outbreaks were severe enough that a Catholic religious congregation was founded specifically to treat sufferers of ergotism. Founded around the year 1095 near Grenoble in France, this group was known as the Hospital Brothers of St. Antony, taking their name from St. Antony the Great, a Christian hermit canonized for his ascetic lifestyle and supposed resistance to the temptations of the devil. St. Antony is often associated with diseases of the skin, and was recorded as having miraculously cured 2 noblemen of ergotism during his life. Grotesquely, hospitals of St. Antony were known as Hôpitaux de Décembre, and would sometimes display the desiccated and blackened limbs that had dropped off of ergotism sufferers during their treatment. In this 1517 woodcut by Hans Barclin, we see St. Antony benevolently looking upon a farmer whose left arm is aflame, and he is also missing his right foot, no doubt suffering a severe bout of ergotism. To this day, the Catholic Church reveres St. Antony as a father of Christian monasticism, and he remains a patron saint for those suffering with skin conditions. But what exactly is ergotism?
Now, I'm not a biologist, and I tend to find all things mushroomy especially confusing, so I'll try to keep this relatively simple.
Ergotism is a type of mycotoxicosis, or mold poisoning, caused specifically by the ingestion of the fungus Claviceps purpurea. This is a fungus which grows on flowering grasses and cereal grains, like wheat, barley, and rye, and it really loves rye. The fungus specifically targets the seed-bearing parts of these plants, replacing seed kernels with fungal growths. This is a real problem for us humans, because it is these seed kernels that we mill into flour and eat. A mature Claviceps purpurea appears as this weird black or dark purple growth on a plant's floret. They remind me a little bit of vanilla pods, though decidedly less pleasant. This growth is called the sclerotium, and it will eventually drop onto the ground and fruit into these little mushroom things. Claviceps purpurea can spread rapidly through cultivated fields as, in its growth stage, the fungus produces honeydew, which in turn attracts insects, which then spread the fungal spores to nearby plants.
Certain species of wasps, flies, and moths have been observed as vectors for Claviceps purpurea infections.
Nowadays, Claviceps purpurea outbreaks are less destructive, though they do still present a problem for farmers. Thankfully, we are now furnished with a variety of ways of dealing with this pesky fungus. Commercial fungicides work well at killing Claviceps purpurea, but good crop husbandry is the most reliable method of preventing the fungus from appearing to begin with. Claviceps purpurea can only survive for about a year in soil, and at a depth of no more than 5 centimetres, so regular crop rotation, or ploughing, will generally keep the fungus away. If you must process a batch of contaminated grain, you can pour the kernels into a brine solution and simply scoop off the sclerotia which float to the surface, which should render the grains at the bottom safe.
Our ancestors, bless them, didn't have our knowledge of agriculture or mycology, so they had to be vigilant for signs of the fungus on their crops. Of course, this is easier said than done, and in times of food scarcity, well, the presence of these gross little black nodules in your grain might be overlooked for the sake of getting food on the table.
The danger of this fungus lies within its chemical composition. See, Claviceps purpurea produces a variety of alkaloids, these being naturally occurring compounds containing nitrogen, that, if ingested by humans, can severely affect our body chemistry, in this case causing ergot poisoning, which can develop into ergotism. The alkaloid concoctions brewed up inside Claviceps purpurea can vary depending on soil composition, but ergotism can generally be divided into 2 types, gangrenous ergotism and convulsive ergotism. If neither sound very nice, that's because they aren't. Starting off with the shared symptoms, both types of ergotism affect the gastrointestinal tract, causing nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, cramps, and diarrhea. Both types can also cause vasospasm, that is, the contraction of the arteries. So how do the 2 types differ? Gangrenous ergotism is fairly self-explanatory, in that it induces gangrene, specifically what is known as dry gangrene. What starts as a cold and tingling sensation in the extremities leads to tissue death, causing the affected areas to shrivel and blacken as the cells die. This process can be accompanied by fever, swelling, blisters, and severe pain, followed by numbness. Gangrenous ergotism causes this by activating various hormone receptors in the body, triggering muscle contractions in the body's organs and arteries. This leads to reduced blood flow to the extremities, which leads to oxygen deprivation, which leads to cell death. Though the one upside of this dry type of gangrene, if you can even consider this an upside, is that the dead tissue can sometimes auto-amputate, or put simply, drop off, without inducing sepsis or blood poisoning, which often accompany the wet variety of gangrene. Not pleasant, but you stand a better chance of surviving, albeit missing a few parts of your body. Convulsive ergotism, on the other hand, is a bit more erratic. This form of ergotism attacks the central nervous system, causing seizures, muscle spasms, burning sensations, and double vision. Gangrenous ergotism was more common in France during the medieval period, while convulsive ergotism appears more in Germany during the early modern period.
This could be due to a variety of factors,
but it is generally believed that the differing soil compositions on either side of the Rhine River cause this. As I mentioned before, different soil compositions allow Claviceps purpurea to produce different alkaloid concoctions.
There is another symptom shared by these 2 types of ergotism, one which has made the illness particularly infamous: hallucinations.
That's right, this fungus can make you trip balls. These hallucinations are caused by lysergic acid-derived alkaloids present within the fungus, and if the word lysergic rings a bell, that'll be because it's what the LS stands for in LSD, sort of. No doubt you can see where this is going. Though not as potent as LSD, these alkaloids can cause similar psychoactive effects when ingested. Nowadays, lysergic acid used for the production of LSD is commonly synthesized from ergoline alkaloids, such as those found in Claviceps purpurea. The activated acid is then reacted with dithylamide to produce the drug.
I really feel for our ancestors on this one. It must be terrifying as a medieval peasant to start convulsing or having your limbs rot off, and all the while you're vividly hallucinating, without knowing why. And even then, the why is that you've been dosed by dodgy bread, which still wouldn't make much sense.
It just so happened that Germany, or rather, the various states which would one day make up modern Germany, experienced something of a witch-hunting craze during the early modern period, specifically the 16th and 17th centuries.
And there may well be a link here.
Some scholars have even suggested ergotism as a contributing factor to the famous North American Salem witch trials of 1692-3. The so-called mouldy bread hypothesis points out that Salem experienced a cold winter followed by a wet spring, conditions which promote the growth of Claviceps purpurea. Convulsive ergotism may also explain the nighttime attacks witnesses claim to have suffered, though current academic consensus does not support this theory, as contemporary evidence points to mass hysteria and social groupthink as being the prime motivator behind the trials. But there were witch trials with a much stronger link to ergotism, specifically in Norway. The 13th century Mariu saga, a sort of biography of the Virgin Mary told in the style of a Norse saga, tells of a so-called evil fire, capable of consuming everything, has no heat, and fills the poor men which it torments with so much cold as if they were frozen both inside and outside. The saga records the fire eating and ripping the flesh from the bones. Norway has a long history and association with witchcraft,
dating back at least to the Iron Age.
Magic was an integral part of the Old Norse religion, and practitioners of Seidr magic, associated with the Vanir goddess Freya, were often revered as prophets and healers. With the Christianization of Scandinavia during the medieval ages, this belief in magic persisted, but the attitude towards its practitioners changed drastically. During the 17th century, Norway experienced a flurry of witch trials, some 750 in total. A number of these witch trials mention the bewitched suffering from gangrene, convulsions, and hallucinations, leading scholars to point to ergotism as a likely culprit. Rye, Claviceps purpurea's most common host, has been cultivated in Norway for around 1,500 years and was widely consumed during this period. In 1667, a woman named Barbara Asmunddatter was put on trial in the town of Farsund in southern Norway. She stood accused of bewitching a child named Gunnar Torkjelsen, who had gone mad and become crippled, with his skin turning black. Gunnar had supposedly teased Barbara and had then been struck down with a spell of lunacy, returning to his family home with blackened skin and remaining bedbound for 7 years. Similarly, in the year 1662, a woman named Klug Ann was accused of bewitching several people in the town of Stavanger. One victim, a young boy, convulsed so fiercely that his body sounded like breaking cabbage. A woman named Margaret Gran accused Klug Ann of poisoning her child, who had hallucinated 2 magical cats, which he attempted to chase, his mouth agape as if he were suffocating. He was then struck down by convulsions so severe that 2 grown men could barely restrain him. Another victim, the son of a man named Roald Snedker, would apparently wade out to sea and remain there, or hallucinate a woman in a long white dress standing above him, which rendered him speechless. Assuming they weren't made up, these symptoms could very well have been caused by ergotism, and in their paper, Ergotism in Norway, Torbjørn Alm and Brita Elvevåg from Tromsø University Museum observed that witness testimonies at several trials, specifically in the county of Finnmark, alleged deliberate poisoning through grain-based foodstuffs, such as bread, porridge, and beer, as a means of bewitching.
Sigrid Jonsdatter, who was convicted of witchcraft in 1663,
confessed that she came upon a means of bewitching when she noticed black specks at the bottom of a bowl of milk and bread. Similarly, Maren Olsdatter confessed in her 1663 trial for witchcraft that she learned the craft after finding something black as dirt lying at the bottom of a bowl of beer. Records from witch trials in Finnmark explicitly mention suspicious black grains present in flour-based foodstuffs. All of these details point towards Claviceps purpurea, the sclerotia of which, as we've seen, appears as a black or purple nodule, or, if ground down, as a gritty red or black substance. These particular witch trials present an interesting break from the usual European and North American trials, in that there is actually a possibility that some of the accused were responsible for the so-called bewitching. It is possible that, through passed-down tradition or simply observation, certain people came to know of the toxic properties of Claviceps purpurea and its potential as a poison. Of course, this is just speculation, and the contraction of ergotism by the victims is very likely to have been accidental, the result of poor quality grain and ineffective food preparation. It's also important to acknowledge that the majority of the accusations in Norway's witch trials don't match the symptoms of ergotism. And, like almost all witch trials, they remain an ill-informed and highly prejudiced reaction to either natural phenomena or mass hysteria, targeting those unfairly maligned by highly religious societies, particularly elderly and childless women. For a good look at the perception and legacy of ergotism, we turn to the world of art. Hieronymus Bosch was a Dutch painter active during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. He's famous for painting lurid and highly fantastical religious scenes. On a personal note, he is also one of my favourite painters. Alongside Francisco Goya, I have a particular fondness for macabre art. One of Bosch's most famous creations is the Triptych of the Temptation of Saint Antony, which depicts Saint Antony the Great's torment by Satan and his devils. What is particularly noteworthy about this painting is how, well, for lack of a better word, trippy it is. Shapes, animals, and people blend with each other and give this work this delirious and almost apocalyptic quality. Contemporary critics of Bosch accused him of dabbling in the occult, and you can see why. Demons are often depicted as horrible impish creatures or animal chimeras, but to Bosch they're these grotesque amalgams of man, beast, plant, and everyday object. This is perhaps best illustrated in his most famous work, The Garden of Earthly Delights. I mean, look at this thing. Bosch remains highly influential in surrealist art, having inspired artists such as Salvador Dali and Joan Miró. So how does this relate to ergotism? Well, as we've established, Saint Antony is heavily associated with the illness. The invisible fire which blackened the limbs and drove men mad bears his name after all. By the time Bosch was painting, the Hospital Order of St. Antony had around 370 hospitals dedicated to treating ergotism. Not a huge amount is known about Bosch, but he certainly had a strong attachment to St. Antony, painting him around 20 times during his career. Bosch would certainly have lived through outbreaks of ergotism, and may himself have suffered the hallucinogenic effects. You can see several symbols of the illness in this painting. Here we see a severed blackening foot upon a rag. Here, a musician on a crutch, with a rotten and gangrenous foot, accompanied by his companion bearing the head of a pig. The two are offered a drink from a ewer surrounded by medicinal herbs. In the background, there is a city aflame, and beneath a table of luxury, we see another man with a crutch, supporting a bound leg, raw of skin. Art historian Professor Lorinda S. Dixon pointed out that these bulbous buildings spewing smoke resemble an apothecary's furnace, and that this creature here, with a long tail, bears a resemblance to a mandrake root, a herb commonly used in the treatment of St. Antony's fire. 16th century Dutch painter Jan Manjin, inspired by Bosch, also included references to ergotism in his 1550 depiction of the Temptation of St. Antony, a man with a missing leg and gangrenous hand, a city engulfed in flames, alchemical furnaces. This blackened, wilting plant has also been pointed out, possibly a grain stalk, which would be interesting as the association between ergotism and infected grain would not be made for another 50 years. Personally, I think it looks more like a dead flower, given the thorns and what looks to be flower buds, but I'm not a botanist. Let me know what you think. For the clearest artistic depiction of ergotism from this period, we go to the Unterlinden Museum in Alsace, France. Here we can find an altarpiece painted by German artist Matthias Grunwald, a contemporary of Bosch. This piece was created for the monastery of St. Antony in Isenheim, a place where those suffering from ergotism could be treated by monks of the Hospital Order of St. Antony. The altarpiece features this depiction of Jesus' crucifixion. Note how Jesus' body is pockmarked with sores and lesions, and his feet are twisted and blackened. Depicting Jesus in this way would provide the patients of the monastery with a degree of solace and comfort, knowing that Jesus suffered alongside them. There is also this depiction of the temptation of Saint Antony, and next to him we see a man clearly suffering from advanced gangrenous ergotism. His stomach is distended, his body is covered with sores, and his limbs are blackened with gangrene. This offers a very unpleasant look at the type of suffering endured by those afflicted with ergotism.
Ergotism is nowhere near as widespread as it was in pre-industrial times, but outbreaks have occurred in the 20th and even 21st century.
In the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, ergotism was reported in the Soviet Union between 1926 and 7. Famine had previously swept across the Volga region at the start of the decade, killing millions, and food scarcity led a desperate populace to consume contaminated grain. Between June and August of 2001, numerous cases of gangrene were reported in the Arsi zone of Ethiopia. It was discovered that a large portion of the region's barley crop had been infected with Claviceps purpurea, causing an ergotism outbreak among the local populace. But the most infamous case blamed on ergotism took place in southern France in 1951. This all started in the summer of that year, with growing reports of food poisoning in the region around the small town of Pont-Saint-Esprit. By August 16th, the offices of the town's doctors, Dr. Vieux and Dr. Gabay, were crowded with townsfolk, complaining of diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and headaches. The doctors suspected tainted bread, as all of the patients had recently visited the bakery belonging to a man named Roche Briand. Numbers grew in the following days, and by the 20th, Briand was arrested and interrogated. An official investigation was ordered by the French judiciary on the 23rd, suspecting a mass poisoning event, but matters would take a dramatic turn for the worse. On the night of August 24th, absolute bedlam broke out in Pont-Saint-Esprit. In his book, The Day of St. Antony's Fire, John G. Fuller gives a dramatic retelling of the events of that night. According to Fuller, the night started with a man named Charles Velladère screaming that his head was made of copper and that snakes were burning his stomach before attempting to jump into the River Rhône. Another man leapt from a second-floor window, believing himself to be an aeroplane. Despite breaking both of his legs, the man proceeded to run 50 meters, flailing his arms, before he was restrained. The mass psychosis was accompanied by absolute panic by those not afflicted, making the situation in the town even more hellish. Fuller describes the scene in the town's overcrowded hospital. They were nearly all screaming and shouting that long night, as they were brought into the hospital on stretchers, from trucks, cars, wagons, any form of transportation that could be pressed into use. There was the man and wife, both bleeding and dishevelled, who had been chasing each other around the kitchen table with knives. There was the woman, with delusions of grandeur, who insisted that she was a baroness, and screamed that she was being persecuted when they dragged her through the hospital doors. There was the woman who was absolutely certain that her 3 children had been drawn and quartered and were hanging from the rafters of the attic to be made into sausages. Though some experienced pleasant visions of vibrant colours, flowers, and celestial shapes, the majority were struck down with visions of horror, particularly of animals and fire. Patients would experience moments of lucidity, understanding that their hallucinations were just that, before falling back into a violent fit. Eventually, patients had to be transported to the centre hospital in the nearby city of Nîmes for treatment. So overwhelmed were Doctors Vieux and Gabay. By morning, the worst had thankfully passed, although 7 people had died, and around 50 were institutionalized with lasting mental disorders. The inquiry found that Briand was largely blameless, and that he had received his flour from a local miller, Maurice MacLeod, who was arrested for involuntary manslaughter on August 31st. MacLeod confessed that the flour he milled was of poor quality, and produced an unpleasantly sticky dough, grey in colour. He revealed that he and his family had been sick after eating bread made from this dough. Although he initially denied cutting his wheat flour with rye, he confessed that he had accepted bags of leftover grain from the baker, Guy Breuer, which did contain rye, as well as an unacceptable amount of dust, weevils, and mites. This revelation led to Breuer also being arrested and charged with manslaughter. Dr. Vieux and Dr. Gabay had suspected ergotism since learning that their patients had taken ill after eating bread, and, in September 1951, Dr. Gabay and several others authored a paper published in the British Medical Journal, announcing that ergot was to blame for the mass poisoning. Most academics agree with this assessment, though recently a few other possibilities have been acknowledged. In 2008, historian Stephen Kaplan argued that nitrogen trichloride may be to blame, as it can be used, illegally, to bleach poor quality flour. Mercury poisoning as a result of fungicide use has also been posited. Strangest of all was the suggestion of Hank P. Albarelli Jr., who argued in 2009 that the USA's Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for the poisoning, having deliberately laced the villagers' bread with LSD. While the CIA did indeed maintain an interest in LSD during the 1950s and did conduct a variety of unethical experiments with the drug, this hypothesis is unlikely for several reasons, although I do recommend maintaining a healthy suspicion of the CIA, particularly during the Cold War. Firstly, the widely reported gastrointestinal disturbances are inconsistent with the effects of LSD, particularly over the course of so many days. Secondly, the agency's interest in the drug came about due to the personal interest of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb became interested in LSD after experimenting with a variety of drugs while working on the CIA's Project Artichoke, a precursor to the infamous MK-Ultra project. Gottlieb was searching for what he called a truth serum to aid an interrogation. Poisoning an entire French village in a completely uncontrolled test environment would not produce any information relevant to his interests. Also, Gottlieb had only joined the CIA a month prior to the events in Pont-Saint-Esprit, and had not yet alighted on LSD as his drug of interest. Lastly, and in my opinion most convincingly, the political and economic situation in southern France essentially created ideal conditions for an accidental poisoning event. As we've seen, outbreaks of ergotism often occur during times of food scarcity, and, in the aftermath of World War II, food safety regulations were frequently overlooked in favour of simply putting food on the table. While France had ended rationing in 1949 and had generally returned to economic normality, the nation was still recovering, and wartime regulations, particularly those enforced by the German occupiers and Vichy French government, were still being updated and replaced. Maurice Mellet and Guy Breuer's confessions revealed that important corners were being cut in favour of increasing food production, creating a situation where ergot contamination could easily occur.
It is likely that certain CIA personnel took an interest in the events of August 1951, and probably made a report or two, but this would have been after the fact. On a side note, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb was a fascinating and disturbing fellow who I'll certainly make a video about at some point. In general, I find the 1950s CIA very interesting, so keep an eye out for that. So ergotism is pretty nasty, and Claviceps purpurea seems like a uniquely horrible fungus. But there is a silver lining. This fungus does legitimately have some useful medicinal properties, and with the power of modern science, we can harness them.
Claviceps purpurea has been observed to induce labour early. A 1582 medical text advises midwives administer 3 ergot sclerotia to a pregnant woman if her labour has stalled. In 1808, American doctor John Stearns wrote that ergot, which at this time was sold in a powdered form called pulvis ad partum, wrote that the substance greatly hastened the process of childbirth, though great care should be taken in its use. While his letter was published in the Medical Repository of New York, his warning was not well heeded, and ergot gained a reputation for inducing stillbirths. By the beginning of the 20th century, various chemicals had been isolated from ergot, which allowed for greater precision in medical use. Ergotamine, an ergot alkaloid isolated and purified in 1918, was discovered to be an effective treatment for migraines. The drug is still widely prescribed for patients suffering from long-lasting headaches. Ergonovine, purified in 1935, is widely used to prevent postpartum hemorrhaging, which has historically been a major risk during childbirth, and today still accounts for about 15% of maternal deaths. So it's not all doom and gloom, and I, for one, am very glad that I can eat my toast without having to worry about tripping on some bizarre alkaloid cocktail and having my arms and legs fall off.
Thank you for joining me today. I found this topic super interesting, and I had a great time researching it. I hope you're all enjoying the content I'm putting out, and I'm forging ahead right now with another episode of Tales from the Cold War. I've also launched a Patreon to keep the lights on and the scripts flowing, so if you're interested in contributing, you can find a link in the description and on my profile. In any case, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon.